The India-UK Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement has recently entered into force. It is being described as the most ambitious trade agreement either country has negotiated in recent years. Agreements like these are never negotiated in isolation. My guest today witnessed that journey from the front row. Mr. Yashvardhan Kumar Sinha served as India's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom between 2016 and 2018, well before formal CETA negotiations began, but during a period that helped redefine the modern India-UK relationship. Today, we'll explore not just what CETA delivers, but what comes next for India and Britain. Mr. Sinha, welcome to Global Order.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kaul. Thank you for inviting me.
CETA has come into force now. Its foundations, however, were laid many, many years ago. So let's go back to the time when you arrived in London as India's High Commissioner back in 2016. What would you say was the state of the India-UK relationship then?
Well, honestly, if you ask me, when I arrived in 2016, the vote had just taken place, the vote for Brexit, and there was tremendous uncertainty. What I was more concerned about is how that would impact the India-UK relationship. And I must say, credit to both countries and their leadership. They identified each other as very important strategic partners. I recall it was in January 2017 when the then Prime Minister Theresa May at Lancaster House spelt out her vision for a globalized Britain. And one of the countries that she identified, among others, was India. So it was like India, US, China, Japan, Australia, and maybe I left out a couple, but these countries I do recall. And sitting in Lancaster House, listening to that speech live, I said to myself that I have some work to do now, because if the UK truly wants to engage, then this is the right opportunity. You will recall that there have been many hits and misses before that. Before the Brexit vote, in fact, David Cameron visited India thrice as Prime Minister and 6 times overall. We had successive British Prime Ministers visiting India, including Theresa May, just before I landed up in London. And there was a lot of hype, there was a lot of promise, not much happened. But I think after India was clearly identified publicly in a very important speech that was reported globally, I'm sure, I think there was a momentum that built up. And I recall it was in January, the same year or February, when Secretary of State Secretary for State for Trade, Liam Fox, met our Commerce Minister Suresh Prabhu in London and launched the Joint Trade Review. So I was very optimistic that things would proceed, understood that it's going to be a very long haul in terms of difficult negotiations, because, you have two economies, different size, different backgrounds, and the complementarities that needed to be brought out up front would take time. And I think the Joint Trade Review was a right step in that direction. So I think they started building up from there, but then you had COVID that intervened. It was a setback. And then you had revolving doors in London and 10 Downing Street, where prime ministers came and went. So even though India was considered to be an important partner, a country that the UK was focusing on, but obviously because of their internal, if I can use the word, political turmoil, things didn't really proceed. Even though, if you recall, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, even during COVID or after COVID, set out a vision with Prime Minister Modi, first through a Zoom call, a web call, a summit that took place and was very ambitious. I remember, I think it was called the Roadmap 2031. And then, of course, you had the problems that he faced internally. And then you had, of course, Liz Truss very briefly, and then Rishi Sunak, and then elections. So I think when the Labour government came to power, Keir Starmer had a mandate, a very solid mandate from the electorate. And I think he was very keen to develop relations with India. But I was there, of course, you had his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, whom I got along very well personally with. Unfortunately, Labour Party adopted positions which were not very favourable to India. So I think what happened during Starmer's time was a course correction. And the roadmap that he and Prime Minister Modi laid out, and the sort of the negotiations that ensued, particularly at the highest levels, the ministerial level, of course, the official level, accumulated in a deal being concluded last year, was in July last year. So I think that was a big bonus, I would say, to both countries. That considering that, for so many years and decades, actually, we've been trying to come to some sort of agreement on an FTA. And this CETA, as it's called, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, has gone beyond a mere FTA. So ambitious in scale, yet realistic, given the disparity in development in the two countries. And I think mutually complementary, because I think both sides have, obviously, negotiations are always give and take. Both sides will benefit from this agreement, I think.
You've actually witnessed the most tumultuous times in the UK in terms of how they viewed India. Brexit did not really help how immigrants were viewed in general. Then we had the problem of how the Labour Party had suddenly become very, very anti-India. So a lot of course correction, of course, has happened. But if you look at the times today, do you think that relationship has evolved? How is it different today from what we saw back then?
I think the relationship to a large extent has matured, at least government to government, because I think there is a much greater understanding of each other's priorities and each other's compulsions, which perhaps was not there earlier. There may have been political will to enhance the relationship, but there were many impediments too. And I recall the impediments when I was there, political impediments related to constituency pressure, and those impediments still exist. In a democracy, and both of us are democracies, we have to be sensitive to public opinion. But then, if you allow a sort of minuscule minority dictate, the terms, then that becomes a problem. And you're talking about violence directed against the High Commission in the past. And I do hope it's a thing of the past, because I think both sides have sort of moved to try and contain this sort of unnecessary irritant, which has the potential of, damaging the relationship. But that has, I think, hopefully a thing of the past. I think both the governments were serious to try and understand each other's concerns. And I think even then we had very receptive voices in Whitehall and in Downing Street, and we had constant sort of high-level exchanges, meetings, etc. And all that has paid off, I would say, because it's step by step. These relationships have to be nurtured. And given the background, given the colonial history, etc., I think it's extremely important to understand that despite all that, both the governments have moved ahead. And that is, I think, beneficial to both countries. And I think as far as India-UK relations are concerned today, they're on a much firmer footing than they were when I was there, or even before I arrived.
Absolutely right. And there was a whole big conversation around reciprocity of deals. And I remember, when early kind of conversations began, it was always feeling like it was a one-sided conversation you were having with the UK, because they wanted the best of your investments, but there was very little or somewhat cautious way of investing in India and growing. And there was, whether it is qualifications, educational partnerships, intellectual property, there's a whole lot of conversation that has gone on for years and years, and not often pleasant. So it's nice to see that many of those asks and things that both side industry kind of rallied behind have now seen the light of the day. So trade agreements, typically often they emerge from negotiation over tariffs, but they emerge really from the trust between governments. Looking back, what were your biggest diplomatic obstacles between UK and India?
I think as far as the public is concerned, I think too much emphasis was given on, for instance, visas. And this is my personal opinion, I felt that there was so much emphasis on easier visa regime for people to travel, especially from India to the UK, that I think we were losing sight of the larger picture, which was, a greater economic exchange, more investments, etc. And once that happened, automatically, visa procedures would be eased, at least for the skill, for the people who contribute to this relationship. And I think that's what's happened, really. I mean, I remember we were bothered about student visas, post-study work visas, and during the Tory government, there was talk about net zero immigration or something like that. And obviously that impacted. And within the cabinet, you had one minister, the higher education minister, for instance, wanting international students, Indian students, because they contributed so much. I remember a figure offhand at that time that was bandied about, that international students contribute about 25 billion pounds to the economy annually. I mean, that's a huge amount, particularly in the situation that the UK finds itself today after Brexit and the global economic downturn. But these issues have been more or less, I wouldn't say ironed out, but they have been resolved. On the other hand, we need to be sensitive also about the UK's concerns regarding immigration. And we are aware, I mean, they have been raising it with us about taking back illegal immigrants. So these are issues that are easier resolved when there's trust in the relationship. And I think to go back to economics, I think in the past, the UK was too much, I mean, they were basically interested in selling, in whether selling their goods, engineering goods, their defense equipment, investments. Yes, I mean, they've had some landmark investments, legacy investments, if I call them, like JCB, etc. But I think there is much more that will happen now, because I think both sides realize that as far as engineering goods, for instance, now let me just be very specific, automotive sector. The automotive sector, India has certain advantages, and they're doing extremely well there. And the complementarity with British design, engineering, you marry the two, you can get a global, first-class global product that can compete globally. And I think that is why I think this FTA or the CETA, you move away from a buyer-seller relationship to building what is an industrial architecture. So I think that's important. That's a big takeaway, I think, that I see from this agreement. And I do hope it will materialize, because as you said correctly, the business communities on both sides are invested in making a success of this relationship.
And what has been interesting is I've been talking to a lot of people up and down the country, both here as well as in the UK. A lot of small businesses have suddenly got interested in doing business both ways, and it's penetrated into that population, which is a large majority of business population. So there is a lot of things that are going to unfold and unravel as we go along.
I just wanted to remind you, if you recall, was it 2017 or 18, we actually launched a partnership through UK IBC as a knowledge partner for SMEs, for the small and medium enterprises on both sides. And I'm glad that, the High Commission did. And I'm glad that this is fructified or is fructifying now, because the backbone of both economies actually are the SME sectors. I think that'd be really good if they are able to cooperate. And I think that such cooperation is facilitated by apex business bodies in the UK and India, like CBI and CII and FICCI and others, but also the governments on both sides. And I know Invest India was our partner at that point of time. So I think we're I think we've built that foundation, that solid foundation that was required for the relationship to take off. And now I think it depends very much on the business community on both sides, how they take this forward.
And when you read chapter wise what it has, it's a very modern piece of document that not many policy documents can claim to be. So what is your reading of, and what strikes you most about the trade agreement?
I mean, I don't want to sort of undermine the importance of tariffs. They're very important. I mean, can you imagine 99% of our Indian exports would be free without tariff, and British exports to India, 90%, I think would be the tariff lines. They would be a reduction or elimination. And that's important. And I think there is a very good balance built in as far as tariffs are concerned. Of course, for us, being not as developed an economy, we have been given a time lag to implement certain tariff line cuts, which is important and which is very useful for us also, because that also serves as a sort of model for India, at least, to conclude agreements with other developed countries. I know EFTA came before the UK agreement, but EFTA was, in my opinion, a much smaller agreement compared to India-UK. And I think the India-UK agreement preceded the India-EU agreement. Of course, the India-EU agreement is a much larger agreement, given the fact that there are so many more countries involved. But I think the India-UK agreement set the trend, and I think made it possible for India and its partners, whether it's the EU or it's Australia or New Zealand, the developed countries, to reach agreements with India. And I think the timing is also important, because we are faced with a very uncertain world. We live in a very uncertain world. We have conflicts raging all over. There is tremendous economic disruption. And I think this is the time when agreements like these will facilitate, you know, at least normal, or as much as possible, normal trading and international trading activity, at least between close partners. Because, you know, the multilateral track is more or less moribund, whether it's the WTO or whether it's the other UN organizations, the UN itself. So I think it's these bilateral and plurilateral sort of agreements that are the way forward as of today. Things might change tomorrow, who knows? But I think that is why the India-UK CETA in many ways is a trailblazer. I could want to use that word because I think it will really help. I mean, when you talk about just pure figures, if our trade can reach $100 billion by 2030, it would be a huge achievement because India-UK trade was always lagging behind, much below potential. And I think this agreement is going to give a huge boost to both the countries, exports of both the countries and the total bilateral trade.
We undermine, of course, tariffs, but it also helps in building more resilient supply chains. People across the world are now very much concerned about building their value chain. They're focusing on how to strengthen and have an alternate in terms of their supply chains. Because we've seen in the recent past how that gets paralyzed when something changes elsewhere. And, so it is very much important. UK and India is a corridor. And it's not just the two countries. These are two very likely candidates for strengthening any kind of global business relationship as well. Taking a cue from there, how does CETA support that global objective for businesses, for governments? And is there any strategic kind of win for both the countries in terms of geopolitics?
I'm glad you mentioned supply chains because we've seen supply chains being weaponized, and not just during times of conflict, but even during times of peace, normalcy. Supply chains have been weaponized. Critical minerals have been used as bargaining tools, rare earth, etc. So, in that context, I think for economies like the India and the UK getting together and not just collaborating in each other's countries, but collaborating in third countries, I would expect, for instance, that CETA would lay the ground for Indian and British companies working together in other parts of the world too, because I think it's important with British technology, British engineering, and of course, Indian innovation, British innovation, if you can work together, because, India is still among the fastest growing large economies in the world. And it would be hugely beneficial because of what the UK has to offer in terms of invention, innovation, and what India is able to offer in terms of expertise in certain sectors. I mentioned automobiles, automotives, but also other sectors. I mean, for instance, the British automobile sector has stagnated, really. I mean, in terms of exports, their share has really gone down, not just the competition from Japan or Korea or China, but also within Europe. I think the other automobile manufacturers have taken the lead. So I think if India is able to sort of supply automobile parts at reasonable rates, and you set up ventures in each other's countries and outside, and supply not just India and UK, but as I said earlier, the rest of the globe, it would be a win-win situation for both sides.
And the CETA very cleverly recognizes the multiple dependencies that any supply chain has. So it's talked about the rules of origin, which is quite interesting.
I think the CETA helps in building trust and confidence, not just among the business communities, but even among the governments and the people. And I see a change in perception on how India is viewed in the UK now, as it was viewed, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So all that really helps. And I think given the situation we are faced with now, the war in West Asia, for instance, has hugely disrupted economies all over the world, especially in India, because we are a major energy importer from that part. So we've been forced to diversify our imports of energy. And the UK has certain expertise in the North Sea, etc. We can work together in the energy sector. We can work together in so many other, in health, critical areas, in education you mentioned. I mean, the UK has the finest universities even today. So I think the sort of research, R&D that can be done, fintech, I mean, London continues to be one of the leading global financial markets or centers in the world. So I think this CETA will go much beyond just trading goods and services, but it will help build confidence in other areas. For instance, again, talking about geopolitics, what is happening to the east of India, for instance, in the Indo-Pacific, the UK has been not so involved. And with the US prevaricating, if I don't, for lack of better word, on the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, I think this is a huge opportunity for countries like UK, India, Australia, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, democracies who are interested in a free and open Indo-Pacific to come together and try and work together to ensure that these supply lines, trade corridors, these shipping lanes are not adversely impacted. And we've seen what happens when a choke point like Hormuz, for instance, is closed, and how the global economy suffers. And you have similar choke points in the east, and in fact much more trade flowing through those corridors. So I think we really need to look at the larger picture. And I think CETA helps us to do so.
And very, very good point made about alternate routes being created, nurtured and, built and protected pretty aggressively by some countries, like-minded countries. So when we've looked at CETA and we look at all the great and the good things that it addresses, including digital collaboration, innovation. It takes care of pretty much everything that the future will want to look at. But there must be still areas that are remaining outside of the agreement. Where do you see businesses still facing practical difficulties? What are the areas that are not yet covered? What are the very granular challenges that we're going to see in the imminent kind of next few years?
I think the greatest challenge facing all of us, not just India and the UK, but the international community, is going to be the challenge posed by AI, because that is an area which remains an imponderable, really, because there is so much innovation happening as we speak, and there's so much disruption that AI is going to cause. So I think countries like India and UK really need to work together. You have the two big powers in AI, the US and China, and both seem not particularly keen to share the technology developed by them. And I think countries like India, we had the AI summit recently, and the UK, which has done a lot of work, need to pool their resources, collaborate, and see how we can come up with our own sort of platforms and verticals, because relying on others is always a very risky business, as we've discovered, whether it was during COVID or whether it was during the times of conflict in Russia, Ukraine, and West Asia. So I think we could look at collaborating in these areas. And I know India and the Indian government is very, very keen to do so, and has been paying a lot of emphasis on AI and developing autonomously or indigenously in India as much as possible. That is one big challenge. That would be more routine in terms of bureaucratic hurdles, clearance of goods. But these are things that we need to look at, and both countries need to look at, so that we can facilitate the boost in trade that we anticipate with the conclusion of CETA. And once you have that sort of political will on both sides, I think it would be very, very, very much possible to overcome these impediments, because I don't see them as major hurdles. But to go back, AI is the biggest challenge. There are some other legacy issues, whether it's the relationship that the UK has with some of our neighboring countries. This actually does impact. I mean, we need to actually insulate the India-UK relationship from that, but it's not easy. It's not easy. But once, again, as I said, once there is trust, I think we will need to work around some of our, if I could use the word, differences regarding, India's neighborhood. For us, it is not only a very challenging neighborhood, but our sort of security is very intimately connected with developments happening in a very unstable neighborhood that we find ourselves in.
Security becomes critically important in today's times, when everything comes to a screeching halt. Life, livelihoods, everything gets affected. I mean, pandemic was one such thing, but then we are in strange warfare times, and nuclear and bio warfare. We don't know what is coming towards us. So it's important that we have a stronger relationship, and a relationship of trust, as you
warfare, or what's happening today, is quite different from what happened even 10 years ago. I mean, those huge military platforms are of no use. We see it in the northern Indian Ocean. You have a flotilla, the biggest arguably the biggest flotilla ever mounted, and yet helpless against small drones and UAVs and missiles. So I think the way we look at defense and security has changed. And I think, again, India and the UK, which has a history of defense relationship, as I said, move beyond a buyer-seller into something more collaborative where we can work together to face these challenges.
And I think technology is going to be our best friend going forward. It has to be. It is almost inevitable now. Regulation is only trying to keep up with it and evolving as we go along. But there's still so much work that remains to be done. And we're looking at going into, we are already in space.
Another area. That could be another area where we can collaborate, because India has got a pretty advanced space program. And I think while we were cooperating with the with the Union, when the UK was part of the EU, but surely I think India and UK can separately collaborate in space exploration and using space exploration for economic development and growth and the benefit of humanity as a whole.
And dependability on traditional fuels, one saw that suddenly all conversation about sustainability goals and things like that were parked on a side for some time. So with CETA coming into force, how do you see those conversations happening again? And would the energy crisis and productivity issues, those big challenges that all of us the world over are facing, how are those going to get addressed through this?
I think that's a very important issue you've raised, because energy is critical for everyone. And when you're going in, for instance, data centers and AI, you need huge amounts of energy. And you cannot rely on traditional fossil fuels to provide you that sort of energy. Even major producers of fossil fuels will find it difficult, but countries like India, for instance, would find it impossible. So the stress on renewables, in my opinion, is far more underlined now than it was when the UK joined the International Solar Alliance. I think it was 2018, when I was there, and we had this big function, I remember, the City of London. We were hoping that India would be able to raise, for instance, green bonds on the London Stock Exchange. They were already raising masala bonds, as they were called then. But because UK is so strong in fintech, I think we need to find ways of financing this transition from renewable fossil fuel to renewables. And India has actually led by example, not just the International Solar Alliance, but what we've done in terms of increasing the energy mix in our grid. We still have a long way to go. For instance, nuclear held a lot of promise, but then it was stymied. Our collaborators said because of our domestic laws have been amended now. This is the right time for, cooperation, further cooperation in the nuclear energy sector. Solar, of course, wind and others. Obviously, they cannot supplant fossil fuels, but they can certainly minimize or reduce dependence on fossil fuels to a large extent. And despite what's happening in the United States, the world leader, I think climate change and action against climate change has suffered because of the United States resigning from its commitments and walking away from international agreements. But even then, the rest of the world can work together. And I think with the technology that the UK possesses, I think we can collaborate, and we must collaborate in that area. Another thing I remembered was, for instance, I visited the Warwick Manufacturing Group in Coventry. Right? Work that they were doing then, I'm talking about 2017, 18, was quite remarkable, whether it was on, lithium batteries or other areas. And I know, for instance, that JLR and Tata, etc., were testing there, but the Chinese were doing much more. So I think there is this huge scope where, British technology and sort of Indian enterprise get together and see what we can do in these challenging times. And I'm sure people are already talking, conversations are already happening. And, that industrial architecture that I spoke about earlier will only happen if we collaborate across the field.
And a great example that you've taken, I'm a personal fan of the late Lord Bhattacharya, having met him a number of occasions. And what he's built is a classic example of when brains, resources come together, what can you make possible? And it's a great example of industry-academia partnership as well.
I had to give that example because it was something I'll never forget, that day I
Yes.
spent at the WMG.
Yeah. No, it is fantastic. Now, after nearly 4 decades in diplomacy, what lesson would you say you've learned about building relationships between nations?
I wish I could answer that question. Yeah, 4 decades and maybe 5 decades, I probably won't have an answer to your question. But no, seriously, I think what is important is to listen to the other side. Often we are talking past each other, not talking to each other. And when you pause to listen to the other side, you may totally disagree with what the other side is saying. But when you pause, you listen, and you try and understand where that person or that country is coming from, then I think you tend to appreciate. And it happened to me, and I'll give you a specific example. In London, for instance, we were particularly unhappy with this emphasis on taking back illegal immigrants, because obviously, it's very difficult for us to identify who is an Indian, who isn't. It's a very torturous procedure. Punjab, a lot of people from Punjab have gone across to the UK, and from both sides of the Punjab. So it's not easy. There are security constraints, and worse still, when you go to do physical checks, practically no family will identify a relative in the UK because they're quite happy that the relative is there, either because that relative is sending back remittances, or probably more likely because the sort of fragmentation of land holdings, people outside, they lose their share or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that I used to always wonder, because I always was very keen that we move ahead on visas, on immigration issues. But this was a major stumbling block. But then I had conversations as to where the UK is coming from. Why is the UK so insistent on that? And I realized, for instance, that the whole of Brexit was fought on this issue. And even though rightly or wrongly so, I'm not commenting on that. But the reaction, and now you have reform, for instance, so strong. So this is a very important issue, which sort of in the street, in the UK, for the public, it's important. Also, of course, there is a diversion, if I can put it that way, because the immigration issue, in my opinion, is also linked to the type of immigration. Because when you have skilled doctors, nurses, as from India, they perform a huge service as far as the British economy is concerned. But when you have, and I'm using it not in a very pejorative sense, but you understand what I'm trying to say, the wrong type of immigration, which promote the sort of extremism. And you see in the UK, the immigrants who've come from those areas are the ones that are creating serious problems. Not Indian immigrants, legal or illegal. Even the illegal Indian immigrants, if you call them so, are contributing towards the economy. After all, I don't know what the latest figures of people of Indian origin are in the UK, but whatever it is, if you see the number of cases against these people, talk about law and order, security, minuscule compared to, say, our neighboring country, to our west, or to a region, that is the problem, because there you have to be discerning. You have security issues. You have these grooming gangs. I mean, it's appalling. When we were there, we'd heard about it, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. When Professor Alex's report came out, I remember it was before I came, but I remember glancing not through the report but excerpts. It was quite shocking, but it was all being swept under the carpet. Now it's coming out. I mean, Parliament is exercised about it. Politicians are exercised about it, rightly so. But that is the sort of immigration that you need to curb. The problem is, you can't sort of shut the door once the horse is already bolted. I think these are the issues that need to be looked into. And immigration, of course, is an issue. I mean, I understand that, but we need to work around it. And I'm sure this agreement, CETA, will help in channeling skilled immigration into the UK, which is what we also want, because they work there, they acquire expertise, they acquire knowledge, and then they come back and contribute to our economy. So they're contributing to the British economy, and then hopefully they will contribute to the Indian economy on their return.
UK has been notorious about raising issues where interference in domestic matters of India are concerned. Whereas with grooming gangs and things like that, where domestic law and order remains to be checked. And there have been many, many such examples where certain notorious MPs have particularly created trouble. I mean, I still remember the attack on the Indian High Commission, which entirely uncalled for when a simple celebration was just taking place, in a quiet, peaceful manner. And to be surrounded like that by goons.
You remember that these incidents have been happening for years. The attack that you mentioned, I had left. But even before that, there were demonstrations. And we used to ensure. I remember you had Preeti Patel as the Home Secretary, and you had Cressida Dick heading the Metropolitan Police. I was closely in touch with both to ensure that incidents don't go out of hand. So it's unfortunate that these incidents have happened, and as I said earlier, I hope these are incidents in the past and are not repeated. I think there is greater sensitivity on this issue. I think as far as these issues, debates, etc., that take place, or issues that are raised. I mean, you're aware of how practically anybody, can book a room in the House of Commons and call it a parliamentary debate. I mean, it's not really a parliamentary debate, but it's a discussion happening within the precincts of Parliament. So that gives it a certain sort of aura. It's nothing to do with the British Parliament as such, except perhaps the venue. So these things, you have these lobby groups that do it. You have friends groups, parliamentary groups that do it. But I'm glad to see that the Friends of India group, whether it's the Conservatives or the Labour, are doing good work in the UK and promoting bilateral relations. I think parliamentary exchanges is one area which, when I was there, was really lagging behind, because we didn't really have, those friendship groups were there in the UK, Friends of India groups were there in the UK Parliament, but they didn't really interact with, groups here in the Indian Parliament. But that is changing, because the Indian Parliament has friendship groups now, and that there have been delegations. I've met a few delegations that have come out from the UK in the last 7 years that I've been back from London. So I think these are very important conversations, because the elected representatives on both sides, across parties, extremely important, because once they are invested in the relationship, it becomes much easier for the bureaucracies on either side, or even the businesses on either side, to build on that.
It's been traditionally a war of narratives, but I think increasingly both countries have recognized the importance of education and connection. And that you can see translating into this agreement that's come into force. So finally, if someone's watching the series and hoping to understand why India and Britain matter to each other today, what is that one message that you will leave with them?
Difficult to sort of put it in pithily in one sentence, but given our history, India and the British, which was always a challenge for both sides, and particularly for India. So India cannot forget the past, but if you're able to build on the past and are able to move forward in terms of building a closer relationship, that is the greatest gain that you get. And I think I see that happening as far as India and the UK are concerned. I think we have, I wouldn't say forgotten the past, I haven't even set it aside necessarily, but we've realized that there's no point harping about what happened 100, 200 years ago. It's very important. I mean, for India, it's very important. I don't want to venture down what we want back from the British Museum or from the Tar, but
there's a long list then.
It's a long list. So it's actually no point going down that list right now. But what is important is that despite all that, the governments of the two countries are committed to this very important partnership, and the business communities and the people. And I think that is where the Indian diaspora, the living bridge, plays such an important role. I heard this term for the first time when I landed in the UK in 2016. I think Prime Minister Modi had used it in 2015 in a speech at the Wembley Stadium, if I'm not mistaken. And now everybody seems to be using it. In Australia, it was being used, in New Zealand. But it's important, because the living bridge, the diaspora, plays a very, very important role. A lot of these misperceptions, understandings, the baggage of history then sort of gets smoothed over by the role that the diaspora plays. And conversely, because of what the contribution that diaspora is making to the UK, to the British economy, I think more and more British people are appreciative of what the diaspora is doing. And obviously, the diaspora represents a small, microscopic minority perhaps, but the larger Indian population back home, and how India is developing as a whole. And they are the people who carry that message and are embodiments of that message, of the direction India is going. So I think that's extremely important. It helps change perceptions. I know we still have a long way to go. When I read certain editorials, and I won't name the papers in the UK, I do get a bit annoyed and upset. And I regularly read some of the papers. There still is a jaundiced view. But that's changing. But once there is this clear realization And I think it would only help not just the economic relationship, but the geopolitical relationship, the relationship in all spheres, basically. And that's what we should be aiming for.
Very well said. And that's not just an aspirational ask, but it's a realistic expectation what should naturally happen between the two countries. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha, for an excellent conversation today. We could go on and on because there's so much to reminisce about.
Thank you for having me on your show. Thank you.
CETA may have been signed by governments, but today's conversation definitely reminds us that agreements like these are built over years through diplomacy, trust, and patient institution building. The real work now begins, not in negotiating the agreement, but in implementing it. Thank you for watching this special edition of CETA Decoded. If you enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe to the channel and follow the series. Until next time, thank you.